The First World War stands among the most devastating conflicts ever experienced by humanity, claiming the lives of more than 40 million soldiers and civilians. For the men stationed on the front lines, trench warfare meant enduring unimaginable hardship. They faced constant illness, freezing cold, starvation, infestations of rats, the stench of decay, and the haunting sight of fallen comrades. Above all, they lived every day knowing that death could strike without warning. Today, we're going to explore what daily life was truly like for a soldier fighting in the trenches of World War I. From late 1914 until early 1918, armies from Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire were locked in brutal combat along vast networks of trenches carved into the earth. These trenches, often around 7 feet deep and several feet wide, stretched for miles across the western and eastern fronts. They were designed to shield troops from relentless enemy gunfire and artillery barrages. Yet while they provided protection, they also created horrific living conditions. Water frequently flooded the trenches, turning them into muddy pits filled with waste and disease, leading to countless preventable deaths. When people imagine trench warfare, they often picture simple ditches scratched into the ground. In reality, trench systems were carefully engineered defensive structures. Both the Allied and Central Powers developed complex layouts that included support trenches, communication trenches, and fortified front lines. Because modern machine guns and heavy artillery made open field combat nearly suicidal, both sides relied on trenches to maintain their positions. These trenches were intentionally constructed in zigzag patterns rather than straight lines. This design prevented enemy soldiers from firing straight down the length of a trench if they managed to break through. The angled sections created defensive positions, corners for protection, and strategic vantage points for observation and counterattack. What resulted was a vast underground battlefield, a grim, muddy world where survival depended on discipline, endurance, and sheer luck. The zigzag design of the trenches was not accidental. It prevented enemy soldiers who managed to jump inside from firing straight down the line and massacring everyone in their path. Each trench had a specific role within the larger defensive system. Some sections were used as temporary rest areas, where exhausted troops rotated out of the front line. Others functioned as supply routes, storage spaces for ammunition and food, or communication passages connecting different positions. There were even designated areas for sanitation and waste disposal, though sanitation was often a generous term given the conditions. While mud might sound harmless, even enjoyable in a modern spa setting, the thick, waterlogged mud of the trenches was anything but relaxing. Soldiers stood for hours, sometimes days, in freezing, contaminated water. Prolonged exposure to these damp and unsanitary conditions led to a painful and dangerous condition known as trench foot. Circulation would be cut off, tissue would begin to rot, and in severe cases, toes or entire feet had to be amputated. Trench foot became so widespread that it affected tens of thousands of soldiers. In response, armies introduced preventative measures. Soldiers were ordered to inspect each other's feet regularly. They were paired together, and each man became responsible for monitoring his partner's condition. Boots and socks were checked daily, feet were dried when possible, and whale oil was commonly applied to improve circulation and repel moisture. The condition was not limited strictly to wartime battlefields. Trench foot can develop anywhere people are exposed to prolonged cold and wet conditions. In fact, there have been modern cases reported at outdoor festivals and large events where attendees stood for long periods in muddy, rain-soaked fields. Although medical knowledge had advanced significantly by the time of the First World War compared to earlier conflicts, disease remained one of the deadliest threats. Infections spread quickly in crowded, unsanitary environments. Even with improved field hospitals and trained doctors, many soldiers still succumbed to illness rather than enemy fire. The freezing temperatures, constant dampness, and filthy surroundings of the trenches offered no protection against disease. Instead, they weakened the soldiers physically and mentally. Lice infested uniforms and bedding, spreading illnesses such as trench fever, which caused severe pain and prolonged exhaustion. Sleep brought little comfort. It was common for men to wake in the night to find rats gnawing at their food supplies, or even at them. The rats, fattened by the abundance of corpses and waste, grew fearless. Some were known to bite soldiers as they slept. The trenches also became fertile ground for one of the deadliest pandemics in modern history, the influenza outbreak of 1918. Years of malnutrition, psychological strain, exposure to chemical weapons, and constant stress had already weakened many soldiers' immune systems. When influenza began spreading through crowded camps and transport ships, it moved rapidly among troops whose bodies were no longer strong enough to resist it. The nature of warfare changed dramatically on April 22, 1915, when German forces released massive clouds of chlorine gas against Allied troops near Ypres, Belgium. Thousands were caught unprepared for this horrifying new weapon. Chemical warfare introduced a terrifying dimension to the battlefield, one that attacked lungs, eyes, and skin with invisible suffocating force. After entering the war in 1917, the United States also began producing and deploying chemical weapons. By the end of the conflict, an estimated 100,000 tons of chemical agents had been used by all sides combined. These weapons injured hundreds of thousands of soldiers and killed tens of thousands more. Gas attacks were unpredictable and deeply feared. A single cloud drifting across no man's land could blind, burn, suffocate, or permanently scar anyone caught in its path. It marked a grim evolution in warfare, a reminder that the First World War was not only fought with bullets and artillery, but with science turned into a weapon. Gas warfare was unpredictable and often depended entirely on the direction of the wind. A sudden shift in the breeze could carry toxic clouds back toward the very troops who had released them. The battlefield was at the mercy of nature, and soldiers knew that survival could hinge on something as simple as the weather. Contrary to popular belief, men were not stationed in the frontline trenches endlessly for months at a time. Most units rotated positions, typically spending several days on the front line before moving to reserve trenches or temporary rest areas. This rotation system was crucial. It reduced prolonged exposure to the harshest conditions and helped commanders manage exhaustion and morale among their troops. However, rest did not always mean relaxation. When units were short on manpower, soldiers used their time away from direct combat to reinforce trench walls, dig new communication lines, or repair damage caused by artillery fire. Others, when given leave in nearby towns, sought distraction from the horrors of war. Brothels near military zones were frequently visited, and the spread of sexually transmitted infections became a serious issue for several armies. Meanwhile, the psychological toll of trench warfare was immense. Soldiers who endured constant shelling, gunfire, and the ever-present threat of death often developed severe mental trauma. The intense environment triggered panic attacks, uncontrollable shaking, paralysis, and emotional breakdowns. During the war, this condition became known as shell shock, a term first used to describe the mysterious symptoms affecting so many troops. At the time, military authorities did not fully understand the psychological nature of the disorder. Some soldiers were sent to hospitals or recovery centers, but others were accused of weakness, cowardice, or desertion. Without a clear understanding of what is now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, discipline was often harsh. Several soldiers suffering from shell shock were court-martialed, and in tragic cases, executed for military offenses. It stands as one of the stark reminders of how little was known about combat trauma during the First World War. Food in the trenches became a defining part of a soldier's daily struggle during the First World War. It was rarely appetizing, often repetitive, and sometimes barely edible, but it was essential for survival. Massive logistical efforts were required to keep millions of troops fed. Field kitchens operated constantly behind the lines, preparing rations that were then transported forward under dangerous conditions. A typical ration consisted of preserved meats such as salted beef or tinned stew, small portions of bacon, dried vegetables, and hard bread. Fresh supplies were difficult to deliver to the front line. By the time bread reached the trenches, it was frequently stale, damp, or contaminated. Rather than waste it, soldiers improvised. They crushed the hardened loaves, mixed the crumbs with whatever ingredients they could find, potatoes, scraps of meat, onions, and boiled the mixture into a thick stew using makeshift containers. As the war dragged on and resources became scarce, food quality declined even further. Substitute ingredients were introduced when staples ran low. Soups became thinner, meat portions smaller, and creative stretching of rations became a necessity rather than a choice. Hunger and monotony were constant companions. Despite the poor meals, one small comfort remained: alcohol. Many armies issued daily rum or wine rations to boost morale and steady nerves before combat. For soldiers facing the constant threat of artillery fire and sudden attack, these drinks offered brief warmth and a sense of courage in an otherwise bleak existence. And yet, contrary to what one might imagine, life in the trenches was not constant action. Long stretches of time were spent waiting, repairing equipment, standing watch, writing letters, or simply sitting in silence. Between barrages and assaults, there were hours or even days of tense inactivity. Surrounded by the enemy and aware that violence could erupt at any moment, soldiers often found themselves battling not only fear, but also boredom. Despite the constant danger, boredom was one of the most common experiences in trench life. Military leaders understood that idle soldiers could become restless and undisciplined, so efforts were made to keep them occupied. Creative outlets were encouraged as a way to maintain morale and mental stability amid the monotony of waiting. One of the most remarkable examples of this creativity was the production of trench newspapers. Among the most famous was the Wipers Times, created by British soldiers stationed near the Belgian town of Ypres, a name they humorously pronounced as Wipers. After discovering an abandoned printing press, the soldiers began publishing their own satirical magazine and distributing it along the front lines. Rather than focusing on official battle reports, the publication featured poems, fictional advertisements, essays, and sharp humor aimed at the absurdities of military life. Its tone blended irony, dark comedy, and quiet reflection. In the middle of destruction and uncertainty, the magazine became a symbol of resilience, proof that humor could survive even in the harshest conditions. Yet perhaps the most extraordinary moment of humanity during the war occurred in December 1914. On Christmas Eve, along sections of the Western Front, something unexpected happened. Songs began drifting across no man's land. British and German soldiers sang carols from their respective trenches, and gradually, a fragile ceasefire emerged. Men cautiously stepped out of their trenches and into the devastated stretch between the lines. What followed was an unofficial truce. Soldiers who had been enemies hours before shook hands, exchanged small gifts, traded cigarettes, and shared food. In some areas, they even played friendly games of football. For a brief moment, the brutality of war gave way to shared humanity, a rare pause in a conflict defined by suffering. Sadly, the fragile moments of peace did not endure. By the following day, gunfire resumed, and former gestures of goodwill faded back into hostility. In later months and years, small localized ceasefires occasionally occurred so that soldiers could recover the bodies of comrades lying in no man's land. However, these truces were far less common than the spontaneous Christmas pause of 1914. Military leaders on both sides quickly issued strict orders forbidding unofficial fraternization with the enemy, determined to prevent any further interruptions to the war effort. Beyond the battlefield itself, The First World War left behind unexpected cultural legacies, including a noticeable impact on language. The trenches brought together men from different regions, classes, and even continents. This blending of accents, dialects, and experiences gave rise to a rich and sometimes darkly humorous vocabulary of military slang. British troops, for instance, nicknamed certain German stick grenades potato mashers because of their distinctive shape. Specialized assault units that launched sudden aggressive attacks became known as stormtroopers. Everyday speech absorbed these wartime expressions, some of which survived long after the guns fell silent. Other terms carried heavier meanings. The phrase basket case is often linked to the war years, describing severely wounded soldiers who had lost multiple limbs and had to be transported from the front in stretcher-like carriers. Meanwhile, the word cooties, popularized around 1915, referred to the lice that plagued troops in the trenches, a constant nuisance in the unsanitary conditions of frontline life. The war reshaped borders, politics, and societies, but it also reshaped the words people used to describe their world. So imagine standing in a muddy trench, facing uncertainty every day. Would you have endured life as a trench soldier during the First World War?